Good afternoon and welcome to the Texas Public Policy Foundation weekly live stream. Since March, which seems like 10 years ago, we've been covering all of the timely issues facing the United States this year. And today we're covering one that is going to happen 2 weeks and 1 day from today, and that is the 2020 elections. I know you might have heard one or two things about this. And so, in typical Texas Public Policy Foundation style, we're going to cut through the noise. We're going to attempt to cut through the spin on both sides and analyze predictions about the election from a think tank kind of perspective. Given all of the aspects of the election this year, from the two candidates for the presidency to conversations about mail-in ballots, concerns about fraud, to state-by-state previews, I think there's a lot to cover. So thanks for joining us. If this is a first-time event for you, welcome. I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and it is a great privilege to introduce our three guests. First of all, our friend, Dan McLaughlin, Senior Writer for National Review, who knows a little bit about some other things like baseball, for example. And then my two friends and colleagues here in Austin, Texas. First of all, Chuck DeVore, Vice President of National Initiatives, and Josh Treviño, our Chief Innovation Officer, a fancy title which means that Josh is a really smart guy. In fact, all three of these gentlemen are very sharp, and I think each of us, you tuning in and myself, will be learning a lot about the upcoming elections. So as we often do, we just want to frame with our first question sort of the context, the proverbial 30,000 foot view question. And Dan McLaughlin, I'm going to turn to you first as our guest and just answer that question for us. What do you think is going to happen? What are the key things that we might talk about in today's conversation for our audience to understand what might happen in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, so I think looking at this election, I think there's really four sets of metrics you would look to see what's going to happen, right? Polls, fundamentals, which is questions like the state of the economy and whether you have an incumbent in a race and things like that. The third is indicators of enthusiasm, right? Voter registration, fundraising, etc. And then the fourth is kind of the softest factor, which is narratives. Right? What are people talking about? What's driving the press conversation? What's driving individual conversations to the extent that we can see them either in person or online. The bad news for, I guess, the pundit industry is that I don't know that we can totally trust the polls, and the polls are the most trustworthy of all of those. So I think some of the others are even less trustworthy, particularly in this election. I think the fundamental factors, for example, I did a deep dive into this for the 2016 election before we even had candidates. And there was very, very strong historical trend away from parties that were coming off reelecting an incumbent. And so we had a strong fundamental factor working in favor of the Republicans. The fundamental factor in favor of reelecting an incumbent, obviously the last several incumbents have been reelected. But historically, it's not actually, incumbents don't actually get that big a boost in like close elections. Historically, things tend to diverge. And we have a very unprecedented challenger here too. Not only is Donald Trump unprecedented in so many ways, but we've never had a guy running for the first time who's going to be 78 a few weeks after the election. He's been in politics for 47 years. I mean, typically the people who knock off incumbent presidents are not, they're typically fresh faces to some extent. And Biden is the absolute opposite of that. And the economic factors that you would look at for, assessing an election it's almost impossible to do because we've never had anything like this happen in an election year. And as to, some of the enthusiasm factors, Democrats definitely have raised more money. Particularly at the Senate level. And that, on the other hand, part of that is also driven by the fact that Republican donors, I think, are more likely to be giving money to the man at the top rather than to the Senate campaigns. But historically, the last couple of elections, I think that a lot of people have put a lot of stock into looking at, okay, let's run the early voting numbers. Let's look at registration trends. Let's look at party ID surveys. And if you followed those the last couple elections, very much more likely than not, you got them wrong. They are not reliable indicators, any of them. Early voting, for example, because so many people in each successive election cycle have voted early, and without that necessarily driving up overall turnout, what that tells us is that A, you can't do an apples to apples comparison, and B, the surges in early voting don't actually mean surges in turnout. So I guess to bring it back then to the polling question, Trump is undoubtedly in a hole. I think he is in a bigger hole than he was 4 years ago, and there are real reasons to think that this could, in fact, be a Democratic blowout. But that nagging, feeling, and not just feeling, but analysis, is still out there. Robert Cahaly of Trafalgar Group still insists that there are lots of reasons to think that pollsters are undercounting conservative voters. And, he was right when others were wrong. I think if you look at the polls in 2018, not just 2016, you see a constellation of states, particularly many of which are the key states this year, Florida and the Midwest, where the pollsters yet again underestimated Republicans right at the end. On the other hand, if you looked at Texas, Arizona, and some of the other states in further into the western side of the Sun Belt, the opposite was happening. Republicans, for example, typically underperform on election day in Nevada compared to their polls. Add to that the fact that we have a highly unusual voting environment. I think we have to live with a certain amount of uncertainty. I think absolutely you would say Joe Biden is a significant favorite, and probably a favorite to bring a lot of people with him down ticket. But there is some very real uncertainty here.
Yeah, thanks for all of that. Excellent information, Dan. You've set the table for us really well. And I think one of the themes we're going to emphasize in our conversation today is that uncertainty, and probably, as I no doubt will discuss later in the conversation, uncertainty after Election Day. So Chuck DeVore, I want to turn to you next and pick up on a couple of those themes that Dan outlined, and in particular ask you, because you spend so much time looking at data, registration numbers and early voting numbers. The same question, what's your sense of where the race is today for the presidency, but also your sense of some of the other races, whether for partisan control of the Senate or things that are particular to Texas?
Well, thank you, Kevin. I first of all say that I agree with Dan insofar as the increasing unreliability of the polling. I think we're seeing even a greater phenomena that was first identified in the late 1970s in England with what was then called the shy Tory phenomena, where people who were called up for polls were a little reluctant to admit their support for Margaret Thatcher and her Tories. We're now, I think, seeing a shy Trump phenomena, especially in the age of cancel culture, where you have individuals that might be worried about, is this a legitimate polling call? I really don't like to even answer all these automated calls I'm getting on my cell phone. If I answer truthfully, is that going to leak out? Am I going to? And so you have to kind of view these polls through that lens, in addition to the fact that, frankly, a lot of these pollsters are coming from the left and, in my opinion, are seeking to demoralize the Republican base. I don't necessarily think that'll work, but these are things you consider when you look at the polling. One of the things that I frequently look at is, of course, you don't win the presidency through the national popular vote. You win it through the Electoral College. And RealClearPolitics.com has been posting and updating a few times a day the battleground polling for President Trump and Vice President Biden, and comparing it to 4 years ago. And when last I checked a few hours ago, Trump was up, as I recall, 0.7%. Ahead of where he was 4 years ago. He's still underwater, but it's just interesting to note that he's actually doing better in the key battleground now than he was 4 years ago. So that's something to consider. And lastly, this thing with the mail-in ballots, I think, could be unprecedented. We saw a huge push from the left, from allied third-party groups, from the Democratic Party, to really emphasize mail-in ballots as a way of overcoming the left's generally high levels of fear over the coronavirus than you see among more conservative Americans. The challenge with this is that many of these states don't have systems that have been set up to properly vet, to process, and to count mail-in ballots at such a huge volume compared to historical levels. And this is going to cause problems, especially on election night, when you're likely to see at least 6 battleground states that are not allowed to count mail-in ballots until election day be uncalled for either candidate, no matter who's winning. You're just not going to have enough of the total count to be confident as to the final results.
And that, I tell you, that concerns me, as I know that it does all of our audience members, regardless of for whom they may be voting, because just as a civil society, we want some certainty coming out of our election. And I want to come back to that in some detail, because before we move to audience questions at the bottom of the hour or so, I want to give our audience a sense of timeline, what your expectations are, even before we do some prognosticating. But before we do that, we really need to unpack this matrix of everything that's so complicated right now. And one of the aspects of the complicated nature of this election, Josh Treviño, is the influx of new voters. And we've been spending a lot of time and resources here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation trying to grasp the extent of that and ultimately the effect of it here in this year's election. I just want to turn to you and ask you to comment on that. That is the impact of new voters in this election and the extent to which that makes this uncertainty even greater.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. So as you said, there is an influx of new voters that have been coming into the system over the past calendar year. And it seems to have accelerated with the onset of summer, and of course, the general population kind of turning its mind and attention to the election itself. A lot of individuals coming into the system who were not participants before. I've heard anecdotes, including from a place like Jefferson County, West Virginia, which is not a hotbed of anything electorally, unless you're talking about very, very local races. But poll workers there and registrars there have commented to people I know that they have no idea where all these new voters are coming from. In this case, literally out of the hills. But in other places, you look at North Carolina, you look at a place like Florida, you look at Georgia, for example, and the new voters are coming in droves and they're registering. And what we don't necessarily know is what they're going to do. Now, not every state does voter registration by party. There's only 31 that do, and then the other 19 do not. But even the ones where there is registration by party, a party registration is not an implicit guarantor of actual behavior on election day. So it's entirely conceivable that you could have somebody decide to become effectively a legacy Democrat, registering for the first time, and then cast a vote for President Trump, which I suspect is going to happen in a lot of different places, particularly among Great Lakes states, come November 3rd, probably prior to November 3rd. One interesting thing about this is that typically when you approach election day, what you usually see, and now this definitely did not pertain in 2016, but it's typical for most elections, is that the window of uncertainty starts to narrow, and you've kind of got this funnel that sort of closes in as you hit the decision point. And it doesn't seem like that's necessarily what's happening. Now, I want to put an asterisk on that. It does depend on who you speak with. There's a lot of very informed individuals, particularly who work in campaigns and analysis, who will tell you that a particular result is baked in. And you can guess what result they mostly tend toward. That it's baked in, that it's done, that there's not much you can do about it, that it looks like about 25% of the 2016 electorate is actually going to vote prior to election day thanks to early voting, and that therefore the cat's basically in the bag. I think we should be very wary of predictions like that. Now, all that may in fact turn out to be true, we're going to see, but nothing is determinative in this case, particularly in the 2020 cycle, which actually is amplifying a lot of the uncertainty and the change that we saw in the 2016 cycle. One thing to remember, and I'll close with this, I'm happy to expand on any of these points, Kevin, but we're in the middle of a realignment, a very profound partisan and ideological realignment in American history. And there's a lot of cross currents in that alignment. These certainties as to who votes for whom, for example, the certainty that African-American men are going to be a solid Democratic constituency, the certainty that Hispanics of any type are going to be a solid Democratic constituency, the certainty that working class Catholic whites in the Great Lakes states are going to be a solid Democratic constituency. All of that's going by the wayside. Similarly with white suburban women who once were a solid Republican constituency, that's all in question. So there's a lot of realignment of pieces. We don't know where it all sorts out, but I want to emphasize that it's a process, and whatever ends up coming of the 2020 election, we have to understand that it is just the beginning. It's part of a narrative. It's not the end of any contention or fight or aspiration for any side. So my suspicion is that we are going to be talking about this election and its effects in 2030. It's that long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I have mentioned to a few audiences recently that regardless of who wins the presidency in a few weeks, both sides, both coalitions, both major parties will undergo a realignment. The foundation for that is there. It's just that whichever side loses is going to initiate that realignment first, at least if they're smart. So regardless of who's on the losing side, I think we're going to be spending a decade or perhaps even more if you look at the history of realignments going through this. So heck, we could have an hour-long discussion just about that. And with the three of you, it would be very good. But I just want to be sure that we're covering every aspect of this election in the time that we have. And so the next question that I'll invite all three of you to weigh in on, but we'll start with you, Dan, is not unrelated to the comment Josh just made about a realignment. In particular, we have a handful of states, Sunbelt states, that you would expect to be solidly Republican states. Arizona, Texas, where three of us are, Georgia, and we're hearing recently even South Carolina, and not just with the Senate race, but potentially even for the Trump-Biden election. And I'm curious, Dan, what you think is underlying that, because regardless of how those states vote in 2 weeks, we know that something is afoot there. We watch this very closely in Texas. Curious what you think the factors are that are causing this.
Yeah, and I would agree with Josh that, as you might say, nothing is written. That you know, this is there. Not only is there a certain amount of uncertainty here, but there's a good deal of uncertainty going forward. I mean, one of the things we have to remember about the future is that this group of states we're talking about now, the Sunbelt states, are going to have more electoral votes and more seats in Congress 4 years from now than they do today. And it will largely be at the expense of the Midwestern states that have shifted, at least in 2016, shifted in the Republican direction. I mean, I think there's a lot demographically going on. You know, one thing I would say, by the way, is as far as predictions, you know, one number that I look at historically, and it's Professor Michael McDonald collects the denominator for this, I guess, but is the share of eligible voters, right? Because you can measure each candidate's voters to the share of all eligible voters, and that gives you a sort of an independent metric to measure each side. The Republican share of all eligible voters decreased from 2004 to 2008. It then actually went down from 2008 to 2012. Romney did better because the Democrats went down. And it went down again in 2016. Donald Trump turned up Republican turnout in some places, such as Pennsylvania, but in a lot of places he won because Democrats were down more than he was. I will go out on a limb and predict. I think we're going to see, I think we're actually, for all of his problems, I think Trump is going to get more votes by this measurement than he did 4 years ago, and possibly a lot more, which again is consistent with what Josh is talking about, all these voters coming out of the woodwork. And Trump could well do that and still get blown out. But you know, we do have a shift of more people into the system. I think the Sun Belt is going to be fascinating because of the number of, you know, your assumption, if you work backwards and think, well, why are Republicans in trouble in these states? Your immediate assumption would be that it's because Democrats are doing a better job of turning out Black voters and Hispanic voters, of whom there are quite a few in each of these states, particularly South Carolina is very large. You know, I think South Carolina and Mississippi have the two largest Black populations in the country. And, you know, and yet at the same time, that's been true for a long time. I mean, Obama turned out a ton of those voters in those southern states and didn't get anywhere. You know, he did, obviously he won North Carolina and flipped Virginia, but in further to the south, it wasn't enough to get Obama across the line. So I think what we are seeing in addition to that is this urbanization of a lot of these states and real erosion in the Republican position among urban and suburban voters, particularly white college-educated women. And as we noted, Mitt Romney had binders and binders full of those voters, and it didn't do him any good. But Trump, at least in part for reasons that are very much personal to Trump and his personality and the way he talks, and I think perhaps to some extent his marital history and whatnot as well, is really poisoned those voters. And on top of that, though, I think we may be seeing a larger societal drift of a certain class of educated white female voter away from Republicans and into reading Robin DiAngelo books, shall we say. And some of that is going to be it's going to be a long-term challenge for Republicans that may well go a lot further than simply the personality of Donald Trump.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work here at the foundation, Dan, on understanding that proverbial suburban women dynamic. And not surprisingly to you, because you're a master of the written word, so much of it is about the vocabulary used. I mean, that's true for every voter, but we just have done a lot of research in the last year understanding that. Some of it is Trump specific, but I also believe that our research shows that some of this has been going on for 10 or 20 years, and that right of center candidates are having a more difficult time conveying their vision, as it were, for that particular group of voters. Chuck DeVore, of course, we could talk about that for a while too, but Chuck, I want to delve a little more deeply into some of the data work you've done, understanding this shift that presumably is going on in Texas, although you pushed back gently on that in a piece you had last week. Give us your assessment of that, not just here in Texas, but considering that most people watching this are from outside Texas, what may be happening across the Sun Belt generally?
Well, I agree with Dan certainly about some of these demographic trends, perhaps coming to a little bit of a different conclusion. Each state, of course, benefits or loses people in a very unique way. For example, Florida has been taking in tens of thousands of individuals from mainly New York. They're often retirement age. They move to Florida for the lower taxes and the warmer weather. Texas has been importing a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of small business people, especially from California for the last decade. The largest contingent on a net basis of people moving into Texas are from California. And I know a lot of Texans are quite concerned about that, but the Texas Public Policy Foundation has done polling about 10 months ago. There's been other polling that has looked into this and has found that people that move to Texas from other parts of the country, even California, tend to be more conservative than liberal. And so what is happening now is that as people move out of California and move to Texas, they're actually making California more liberal and Texas more conservative, which certainly has some interesting electoral implications. I think the other thing that is going on is that there is quite a bit of a transition going on right now within the Democratic Party. Vice President Biden is definitely a transitional figure. As Dan pointed out, he's going to be 78 years old, only 2 weeks after the election. He chose as his running mate someone I'm very familiar with as a former Californian, Kamala Harris. She was Attorney General in California and then became U.S. Senator. She has amassed the most left-wing voting record in the U.S. Senate in her time there. And that's pretty remarkable when you think that the Senate includes people like Bernie Sanders. And so what should be somewhat concerning to people when you look at, for example, the squad in the House, the so-called squad with Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and others, you look at Kamala Harris, you realize that the old Clinton party, the party of what I would term crony corporatists and street financiers, is beginning to fade away into the sunset. They are not going to be controlling the Democratic Party much more. It certainly will be a big source of donations, but are no longer any sort of significant source of new ideas or of electoral votes. And so what you're seeing is this radical shift to the left, to the progressive left of the Democratic Party. And what should concern some voters and may in fact may prevent some of this realignment away from Republicans that has been feared is when you look at, for example, the urban unrest within TPPF, you look at Black Lives Matter and the founders with their openly stated Marxist ideology, defund the police. You look at these, reparations. The state of California just passed a law, although I think Governor Newsom actually vetoed it, which would have called for reparations, a study of reparations in California. So this is a pretty radical agenda, and when you look now that what's happening in our urban centers with for example the murder rate beginning to go up significantly in many of these urban centers, the fact that we're probably looking at violence on election night and the days and weeks after, I think it's going to give a lot of people pause who might otherwise embrace the message that Vice President Biden is trying to convey.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. So Josh, let's pick up on that theme of urbanization. In fact, as we have discussed often here, we know that urbanization is one of those factors in some of these formerly solid Republican states being toss-up states this year. So what is it about urbanization that apparently draws people to the point that they might vote for a left of center candidate?
Yeah, well, honestly, if I could answer that question, I would immediately leave the Zoom and sell it to the Republicans for $20 million. But I can't, so I'll stick around. But it is the right question. It's just a reality, and it's been evident increasingly evident over this century. So for the past 20 years, that the higher rate of urbanization you have, the more likely you are to produce Democratic votes. And so it hasn't been true for all urbanization, although I think that's changing. So you'll take the state of Texas for an example, and it's just one example, but it's pretty representative. The state of Texas has 5 major urban centers. So you've got Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, 2 of which are essentially merged for all intents and purposes. And they have gone left. They went left a long time ago, especially the urban cores. So the dense urban centers of all those cities went blue, went left some time back, and then kind of conservative ascendancy, or I guess Republican ascendancy, which has been mostly conservative in that 20-year period, has really been maintained by what I would describe kind of the second tier of cities. So they're not large urban areas, but they're places like Waco, Corpus Christi, Sherman, Lubbock, Amarillo, and so on. And so you see this pattern that's repeated itself in other places across the country. So for example, in Louisiana, New Orleans might go left, but then you'll have places like Baton Rouge, Lafayette, Alexandria that are going to go that are going to be relatively red. So it has been until recently a phenomenon of really big cities. Like you had to have a giant world-class conurbation to essentially guarantee that there's going to be a block of blue votes there. What's interesting and alarming, if you're kind of on the liberty side of things, is that the phenomena appears to be extending to urbanization in general. And what I mean by that is that it's not just these urban cores anymore, but you're also seeing some of the mid-sized cities that have become tinged more purplish. And most crucially, the suburbs and exurbs of these large cities have started to become more, trending leftward. Not necessarily blue, but certainly not the red lock. So one example that I think is going to be very interesting, and I urge everybody to watch on the evening of November 3rd, is the city of Atlanta. And going north of Atlanta, those of you who've had the misfortune to experience a lot of Atlanta traffic know that Atlanta kind of branches out in this kind of this northwesterly direction, and you go to the Mall of Buckhead or whatever. But Cobb County and then the next county past that are places where that kind of anchored. It's densely populated, but they're suburban and exurban, and they continued to anchor the state of Georgia on the right, despite the leftward trend of the city of Atlanta proper. Well, what's happening now is that those areas are in contention. If I had to guess why, and again, these are just guesses. We'll see what happens on November 3rd. But I actually do think suburban white women have a lot to do with it. It's been mentioned here before. So the question is, to get back to what you're asking, Kevin, what is it about urban areas that tends people left? A lot of hypotheses, not a lot of really good research along those lines. But I would suggest 2 things. One is that definitionally, an urban area may not necessarily have the same lattice of lateral social ties that a smaller community might. You've got the old story, which is literally hundreds of years old now, in the West of somebody leaving the village and coming to a city and becoming alienated. It's like half of Russian literature right there. I've just described for you, so now you don't have to read it. And so in the absence of those strong social ties, there is a greater appeal of statism, left-wing programs. The other thing that I think is probably trending urban areas to the left is the fact that there's a ton of social diversity, and this does highlight a deficiency, kind of a systemic deficiency on the part of the conservative coalition writ large. The conservative coalition writ large has, and I'm strawmanning a little bit, has a lot of great ideas. If you are non-white, if you're Mexican American, if you're African American, and so on, because the foundation of liberty is the foundation for all of us, and we know that. It's the best path to prosperity and dignity for every American. However, the ability to communicate that in a productive fashion has been an operational deficiency of ours. And as a former communicator, I'll assume some responsibility for that too. But when you hit areas that sport that kind of diversity in an extraordinary array, think of the city of Houston, where they like to boast that 90 languages are spoken every day, 3 of which people understand. This is just an area where conservatives have work to do. So I guess that's how I would synopsize it. There's a communicative component to it, but there's also a societal component to it. We can overcome the communicative part of it. It just requires work and application. The societal part, I think, is a much more profound issue that's going to take generations to solve.
Yeah, and it's going to happen while this political realignment is occurring, and it will inform that to the extent that each side is willing to have a genuine conversation or series of conversations with those groups. So let me ask 1 or 2 other questions, and then we'll switch to audience questions, which reminds me, if you are tuning in, a member of the audience, and you have a question, just type that question into the comment section of whatever social media channel you're using. But Dan, I want to turn to you next and ask you about timeline. We have a lot of states, as you and Chuck outline, that have varying rules and laws about when they're going to count the mail-in ballots. We also have something you've touched on, which I believe is absolutely going to occur to some extent or another, the potential for fraud in a number of different forms. What's your best guess about when we will know who the winner of the presidential election is?
I mean, I think that when we will know depends on who it is. I can't see Donald Trump being declared the winner on election night.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that Joe Biden is going to be declared the winner with, 275, 280 electoral votes on election night either. I think if it's the Biden blowout, then it's much more likely that we'll know. Even if there's still a lot of counting to go, I think that if things are really ghastly for Republicans, we'll get a pretty good look at that early in places like North Carolina and Florida. So the trouble signs will be there. And the thing you have to remember, and I think probably Chuck knows the exact timeline, some of the more exact timelines more precisely than I do. But I mean, in terms of mail-in voting in particular, there are some real potential problems with mail-in voting systems, and their defenders tend to say, well, okay, but look, we've been doing this in Oregon, we've been doing this in Utah for a long time. Okay, but you're trying to map this onto the systems of states like New York and Pennsylvania that don't even have a tradition of early voting, let alone mail-in voting, right? I mean, many of these states either instituted early voting just within the last few years or are just trying to do it now, on top of having a huge amount of their electorate switch to mail-in. And New York and Pennsylvania both, we've seen some very major, huge numbers of ballots sent out that had to be then scrapped, and then a second ballot sent out, or their ballot applications rejected. And so, I don't think that is fraud. I think that is incompetence, and perhaps inevitable incompetence, given what people are trying to sort of turn a battleship in a bathtub here. But obviously, the more incompetence you have, the more opportunity it presents for bad actors. It's certainly within my lifetime, and I think, well, I guess all of our lifetimes on this panel, to remember, for example, when we had a governor's race in Illinois, where there were like 100,000 fraudulent ballots in Chicago, and that was in the early 80s. And I think conservatives have thrown around charges of voter fraud without sufficient evidence too many times, frankly. And I don't think that we're all that likely to see voter fraud on the scale of the 1982 Illinois governor's race again in our lifetimes. But I think also when you ask people who say voter fraud is gone and impossible and never going to be a factor anywhere, well, what exactly is it in our system that prevents a repeat of this sort of thing, or prevents a repeat of this sort of thing in an election that's decided by a few hundred votes or 1,000 votes? And they don't really always have good answers for that. I think the motive and the means and the opportunity still exist, and because of that, we should be concerned. It's been a long time since we've had a presidential election that was up in the air as to the initial counting for so long after the election. Of course, the 2000 election, the count was basically done, I think, by the day after the election or so, or within a couple of days. But then we had the lengthy recount litigation. I think we could have that now. And I know the Supreme Court desperately wants to avoid getting involved in that, but probably will end up having no choice. I think the last election that was really in doubt for a long time just for the counting was in 1916. It took, I think, something almost like 2 weeks to count California, which was the decisive state in that election between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes. So the country was a little more willing to wait at the time. I think there will be a lot of uncertainty in the streets, uncertainty in the financial markets. Financial markets are going to hate it if we're 2 weeks after the election and we have no clue who's going to win it.
Yeah, there's real potential there for the markets to go haywire. So thanks for that analysis, Dan. Chuck, what do you think about this question of timeline, in particular, given the work you've done at the very small detailed level of when these ballots will be able to be counted state by state?
Right. So first of all, I agree with Dan insofar as these states that have rushed into expanding mail-in voting. We saw in the primary more than 500,000 ballots were invalidated because people were unfamiliar with how to fill them out. They didn't properly sign the back envelope. They didn't make it in. In fact, there was a study out of, I think, MIT, Washington Post of all places, that said that somewhere north of 3% to as high as 4.9% of all mail-in ballots never convert to a vote because of the U.S. Postal Service failing in delivering the ballot, the voter failing in properly filling everything out, and then failing in getting the ballot back to the election authorities. And so what we see is 6 states that are both swing states, currently too close to call, that do not allow the counting of mail-in ballots until election day itself, or in some cases, once the polls close on election day. And that's Georgia, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now in Texas, Texas as well doesn't allow it, but if a county is of 100,000 people or more, they can start counting when the early in-person voting ends, which is Friday before the election at 7 p.m. Texas over the weekend and Monday and even on election day to start counting those mail-in ballots in those large urban areas. And so the challenge is that many people believe that President Trump is going to dominate the election day votes. And so what that likely means, if that in fact happens, is that in all 6 of those states, even in Texas, you're likely to see a greater margin in favor of Trump on election night. And then you're going to see that margin get whittled away in the hours and days and potentially even weeks after the election. This may especially be the case in the pivotal state of Pennsylvania, where normally there's about 300,000 people that vote by mail in a typical election. And now we're looking at potentially about 3 million people voting by mail in Pennsylvania. And so you have to balance 2 things. Does Vice President Biden dominate that pool of 3 million voters, number one? And number 2, are we going to see a failure rate somewhere around 5%, where 1 in 20 of those 3 million votes, potentially overwhelmingly for Vice President Biden, don't even get counted because of weaknesses within the mail-in ballot system. And so those are some of the interesting X factors. I think it may take in a really close election where Pennsylvania could decide it, and there might be some litigation about, do you allow ballots without a postmark to be counted if they come in after election day? This is being actively litigated. So I think it's entirely possible that in a close election, especially if Trump is winning Pennsylvania by a thin margin, that you see the Biden team not conceding and just trying to squeeze out every last vote in Pennsylvania to try to win it, if that's the deciding factor. Lastly, I think it's very important to emphasize that many people believe that the Democrats, if things are going kind of at a razor's edge on election night and the days after, many people believe that they will call for significant urban demonstrations to pressure elections officials, state legislatures, secretaries of state, and governors into deciding in favor of Vice President Biden. And so this is another unsettling thing that we really haven't seen before in certainly recent American history. And there's a good chance that some of these demonstrations may get out of hand and lead to destructive rioting.
Well, gosh, between the two of you, Dan and Chuck, you've really outlined for our audience what's at stake and how difficult I happen to think the several weeks after the election will be, because first of all, I'm making the assumption based on some intel and analysis internally and externally that we're just not going to know the winner. I think the election is that close, even if it were held today, and it probably will be even closer. I think it's the next 2 weeks will end up being more favorable for the Trump campaign, just a nonpartisan assessment based on what we know their ground game to be. Josh, I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. And that question is, in fact, about that period of uncertainty. You in particular have been concerned with very good reason about urban unrest in the period following election night. We're optimists, right? But how ugly do you think that picture gets if we get a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks after election day and we still don't know who the winner is?
Yeah, you know what? The ultimate answer to that, I want to be 100% clear. And if you take nothing else from this, this is the most important thing. The ultimate answer to that is in the hands of local authorities, mayors, state governors, county officials who have the lawful authority and the power to make sure that their communities are peaceful and orderly, no matter what happens. And so we should understand that with very rare exceptions, incidents of civic violence in America, of which we've seen literally thousands in the past 4 to 5 months, are entirely the result of often a deliberate application of that authority. So I just want to be clear about that if we see unrest, and I think there's a real possibility that we will, in the case of a disputed election or an election that drags out and it's not an election day, but it's an election season, it is something that is first of all foreseeable. And so there should be planning underway right now, whether it's with state National Guard bureaucracies, the local police departments, and that is happening in some places for that. And it is also a matter of political will. As a rule of thumb, elected leadership that does not tolerate this will not get it, and their communities will be safe. So that's their first obligation. What we've seen in 2020, but even before that, this is something that's been unfolding now for most of the past decade, and it's not a phenomenon of the Trump era. I want to be crystal clear about this. The modern era of political violence in American streets starts under the Obama administration. It starts with the Occupy movement and then moves on to the first emergence of BLM around 2015. And so we're seeing now an extension and culmination of it. But there are robust radical networks out there that have developed the tactics and the manpower to take to the streets and do a lot of damage when politics do not go their way, or as a means of influencing politics to go their way, which unfortunately has worked several times in their favor. So I think you'll see them again if there is an extended uncertainty in the election. There seems to be kind of a weird symbiosis between these actors and some of the institutional elements of the left. Again, that's not a partisan judgment, it's just an expression of reality. I mean, we know for a fact that the Biden campaign was bragging about its willingness to bail out arrested protesters, arrested for violent acts in Minneapolis earlier this year. And there's been a lot of media covering for them as well. So unfortunately, I would expect them back, but my hope is that responsible leadership, dedicated to civic safety for all Americans, will try to shut most of that down. That being said, you're going to get one set of outcomes in Oregon and probably another in Texas, and that's just going to be how it is.
Yeah, and as I said, we're optimists here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, as I know Dan McLaughlin is too. But I think it's real important for us to be preparing for that kind of scenario. So let's move to some audience questions, gentlemen. We have several in the queue, and Chuck, I'm going to pitch this first one to you, being a former Californian and former member of the California Assembly. Are the Californians moving to Texas the reason for the blue shift that we're seeing?
Well, no, I think they're saving Texas from a blue shift brought on by urbanization. When the Texas Public Policy Foundation did a comprehensive poll of about, I think it was 100 likely voters last December, so 10 months ago now, we asked the question, were you born in Texas or did you move here? And then we asked the question, did you vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 or did you vote for Donald Trump? And what we found was that a greater margin of people who had moved to Texas voted for Trump than natives did. In fact, as I recall, the margin was 5 points. You saw that again in 2018 during the Ted Cruz, Robert Francis O'Rourke race, where there was a CNN exit poll that asked, are you a native-born Texan or did you move here? And what was fascinating about that is that among people who were native-born Texans, and by the way, Ted Cruz is not a native-born Texan, the native-born Texans preferred O'Rourke by +3. People who had moved to Texas, which constituted 40% of voters, favored Cruz by +15. So there was an 18-point spread in that exit poll. So we keep seeing evidence time and time again that the people moving to Texas, by and large, are more conservative. Certainly there could be exceptions in places like Austin, where you have a large tech community and a lot of people move here from the Bay Area, and naturally those people are going to be more left of center. They're more left of center than the average Californian. Yeah. So I think it's a little more complicated, and I think that urbanization trend that has been discussed is kind of in counterbalance with the new people moving in.
Yeah, and if we were to write a headline here from TPPF, we would say that that's a bigger factor than the Californians who moved in. Of course, we'll have even more data in a few weeks that I'm sure, Chuck, you'll be poring over. Dan, I'm going to pitch the next audience question to you. This audience member asks, considering the pandemic and the extended economic shutdown, how do you foresee the outcome of this election affecting America's recovery?
I mean, I think that's that's very much an up in the air question. And by the way, one thing I would add, and this goes into the question of what to expect from the election, but also the timeline of the election is, let's not sleep on the fact that this is a up and down the ballot election. These races, the races we're going to be watching may be unfinished for weeks or even months after election day, could well be down ticket races as well. And those are going to have a big impact in it. The question of who controls the Senate, I think, is going to be very, very important. It's actually the least likely possibility, but one we shouldn't ignore, is that Trump might actually get reelected and Republicans lose the Senate. And I think if that happens, you're going to see, a presidency that isn't able to do very much. And is going to have to fall back more and more on executive actions that perhaps will look like things that a lot of conservatives are skeptical of in terms of assertions of executive power. On the other hand, I think, if Joe Biden is elected and Republicans hold the Senate, then, when you're talking about the Green New Deal and all of this trillions of dollars in spending, I think that stuff is not going to be so much on the table. It's going to be very hard to get Mitch McConnell to sign off on $2 trillion of anything. The recovery, I mean, I am worried that one of the major steps to recovery is, frankly, getting people to take a vaccine, to accept that a vaccine is safe, to accept ongoing restrictions, And there's still plenty of debate over which restrictions, whether it be masks or social distancing or lockdowns of businesses, which ones are actually helpful and which ones are just kind of lockdown theater. But I think the political divisiveness of the election is likely to continue, making it hard to get people to listen to public health authorities. Democrats have been talking up the idea that maybe a vaccine, and I'll give you an example of what would be helpful. What would actually be helpful? Let's say if Biden wins and Pfizer or somebody announces that a vaccine is ready to be tested by the FDA, in the end of November. It would be certainly helpful if you had some sort of coming together by the outgoing and incoming president to get on the same page as far as what the voters should expect. Should they trust that this process is going to work and going to deliver a result that is trustworthy? I don't know if that's going to happen. And the Democrats have certainly thrown around ideas that any vaccine developed on Trump's watch is a Trump vaccine, right? And you don't want to take a Trump vaccine. And I think that is a dangerous game to be playing. So the long and the short of it is that both economic policy and pandemic policy are going to be, there's going to be a lot of variables in this election that affect those. And finally, we should remember, particularly as far as the pandemic, that, man proposes, God disposes, right? So many of the things that even the best, sharpest scientific minds have said over the past several months have turned out not to be borne out by evidence, or at least that predictions did not come true. We may have more waves coming that nobody is really foreseeing. We see signs of that in Europe, and that's none of that is the fault of Republicans or Democrats in the United States. It's just the fact that we're dealing with something that is at some level beyond human capacity to control.
Yeah, that is well said. A very important reminder. In fact, in an era when so many Americans believe that government can be the answer to so many things, I think we're seeing the really bad evidence, or evidence of a really bad conclusion, that government can also fix something that biology and what I think the four of us understand God's in control of. So a couple of final questions, one more from the audience, and then I'll ask just the ultimate final question. And Josh, I'm going to pitch this one to you. This audience member is asking about the walkaway movement and the effect that it may have on the election. I might, if that audience member doesn't mind, pitch that in a more general way and link that back to some of the comments y'all made about realignment, about the weakening coalition left of center. You yourself have done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with it, the walkaway movement is something that took life on social media, and so it's been promoted, I think, primarily by individuals like Candace Owens and others, basically urging African Americans to walk away from the Democratic Party, to not be a locked-in part of the Democratic coalition. I want to bifurcate my answer on this. One is that walkaway as such, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that it's had much effect except on social media. However, this is the other part of the answer. I have seen that independent of that, and they may be bundled with one another, so the former may be kind of an emanation of the latter. Independent of that, there actually is considerable evidence that ethnic minorities, chief among them African Americans and then Hispanics writ large, who are traditionally part of the Democratic coalition, are now weakening parts of the Democratic coalition. And it's been very, very interesting. If you look at kind of the ideological realignment just of the Democrats, what's interesting is that if you rewind the clock, say 40 years or so, and you kind of looked at where everyone stood within kind of the median Democratic coalition, you would find your average African American or Mexican American voter in that coalition somewhere on the left-hand side of that coalition, to the left. Now those views that are held by that median voter from those two ethnicities really haven't changed that much over the years. There hasn't been significant movement. But what's happened is that the coalitions have changed. So by staying still where they are ideologically, African Americans and Hispanics have actually moved, and now they're anchoring the right wing of the Democratic coalition, which by the way, really tells you just how far left kind of the elite Anglo part of that coalition has really gone. And so now that they're kind of on anchoring the right wing of the coalition, what's interesting is that we see, you kind of see two things at work. With African Americans, you definitely see a greater openness to, and you see this in polling now, especially among African American men, greater openness to at least considering voting Republican. Now, the voting behavior always precedes the partisan ID by probably about a generation. So, you have to let that kind of unfold in time. But there's evidence that, by the end of this coming decade, that it could be actually a contested demographic, which would be earth-shattering. It'd be the first time it's happened in over half a century. And then with Hispanics, and when we talk about Hispanics, we're talking really 80% Mexican American. There's a lot of evidence that this historically Democratic voting group is very, very open to kind of what the Republican coalition is becoming, which is much more of a right populist working class coalition. There's been a lot of evidence. We've talked with political professionals who have identified places like Laredo, Texas, where there basically is no Republican Party, as a huge reservoir of Trump voters. There is evidence, for example, the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Telemundo poll after the first presidential debate in early October, which every single demographic group absolutely panned the president's performance, except for Telemundo viewers who thought that he won it by a 2-to-1 margin, which is actually out of this world. So but first of all, it tells me that Donald Trump can become the president of Mexico anytime he wants to. But the other part of it is that when you look at that, and then the final datum I'll cite is the outcomes in the Florida elections in 2018, where it turned out that the state, which if you'll recall was supposed to go blue permanently because of all the Puerto Ricans predominantly moving into the I-4 corridor, turned out to be pretty friendly to Republicans, and it was Puerto Ricans and then African American women who liked the education freedom message, put a guy like DeSantis over the top. So that's what's happening. Nothing. To echo what Dan said, who was echoing Lawrence of Arabia, nothing is written, and we should be open to a lot more change coming.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue into the last question. It's a real big question, guys, that we just have a few minutes for, but I would like at least a brief response from each of you because you've been so excellent in this conversation. And the question is, what's the future of the conservative movement as soon as we know what the outcome of the presidential election is? And that sort of means that you have to reveal what you're thinking about the state of the presidential election is now in order to tell us where you think conservatism is going. Chuck, we'll start with you.
Well, I think the president is in line to win potentially by a larger margin in the upcoming election than he did 4 years ago. Pardon me. And I think that the conservative movement, as has been hinted at several times, is becoming more populist and more working class. What I'd like to say is that it's beginning to understand that the materialism that you see that is an intrinsic part of not only Marxism, but even libertarianism, that somehow mankind is nothing more or less than Homo economicus, that understanding is beginning to be superseded by a more complete understanding that takes into account, for example, why do we have so many people dying from overdose deaths, the overdoses of despair, fentanyl, the effect of employment on family formation, and the positive effect of faith and community. And so these are things that I think that for far too long, the Republican Party and the conservative movement has ignored at its peril. And I'm not suggesting that they're abandoning support for deregulation and lower taxes, but rather augmenting that understanding with a more complete appreciation for what makes for healthy individuals, healthy families, and healthy communities.
Yeah, then so many good repercussions from that, if in fact it happens. Josh, what about you?
Well, I think the president will overperform versus where he is, just because I think that's kind of the nature of polls and sort of the nature of his support. My anticipation, and hopefully, I hope I'm wrong for a host of policy-related reasons. Again, not a partisan expectation, but my expectation is that there will probably be a Biden presidency, and in which case the right is going to undergo a convulsion. Because there will be an attempt by certain elements on the right to reassert what they think wrongly is the natural order of things, with sort of this old style coalition of, and I agree with a lot of what Chuck said, fetishizing the markets, kind of a materialist view of humanity, a really libertarian based approach to to governance, and that is going to probably decisively fail within 2 years. There will be a reaction that sets in because the left will overplay its hand in governance badly, and we're already seeing that in a lot of different spheres. And look, if you think of the attempt at imposing a racial reckoning on America in the past few years as a smokescreen for the real class reckoning that actually is going on, which I think is probably an accurate interpretation, only the right is constituted as a political coalition to take advantage of that, to encompass it, and to see it to its fruition. So I fully expect conservative populism to eventually win within 2 to 4 years of this election and be the defining force that drives the rest of the decade. And everything else is going to be in reaction to that.
Interesting. Dan McLaughlin, last word.
Well, I'm a lawyer and a history guy, and being a lawyer, I'll start with my caveats and warnings first, which is, I mean, I definitely expect, far more likely than not Biden to win, but we all know that that's not a certain outcome. The caveat here is that, the reports of the demise of the conservative movement and the Republican Party have been greatly exaggerated many times in the past. But I do always try to remember that, when I was 18 years old or so, we thought that the Berlin Wall would be up forever and the Democrats would never lose control of the House of Representatives. And, all things do come to an end. So we do have to consider the possibility either that Trump is elected and the Republican coalition continues to fracture, Trump's personality continues to turn off whole generations of, woke, educated college kids, and maybe the country does begin to look more like California. I think we also have to consider the possibility that Democrats will take control of and use their power over things like court packing and the admission of new states in a way that will in a way that will make it very, very difficult for Republicans to gain political control again. All that being said, I think the history of American politics and the history of conservatism is that the more likely answer is that Biden takes power. He pushes the internal contradictions of his own coalition to the fore. He tries to do things that, he's brought a lot of people. A lot of people have come into his party, particularly a lot of these suburban voters who didn't like losing their state and local tax deductions and that sort of thing. There's a lot of people who are basically on the Democratic bus right now who are not signing up for a big left-wing agenda. And I think if that gets pushed through Congress, or at least pushed by Biden and by people in his administration that he's not strong enough to stand up to, I do think that there's a significant possibility of a real reaction to that. I think Republicans then are in a much better situation to retake Congress, or retake the Senate, at least in 2022. And I think that as far as the conservative movement, I think the tradition of, the conservative movement and its place within the Republican coalition has always been fusionist. That the coalition works when you have, the traditional gut level conservative faction, the populist faction, the sort of classical liberal constitutionalist faction. When you're able to find leaders who can bridge those divides and appeal to more than one faction of the party. I think Trump has had trouble doing that. I think if he wins, it will be in spite of those troubles. But I think the time in the wilderness, if Trump loses on election day, or election month, as you will, may well prove to be quite productive in setting up the party and the movement to rethink in ways that don't involve, burn everything down, but really are much more a matter of figuring out how different groups within the actual Republican coalition and the potential Republican coalition can learn to live with each other.
Well, that's well said. For those of us who study these things, and of course we care very deeply about the outcomes of elections in our private time, but in our public sphere, at least here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in a 501c3 friendly way, nonpartisan way, we're going to be fascinated with whatever happens. I can tell those of you tuning in who are our supporters, we're prepared for either scenario because that's what we have to do. And in the process of reading about the next 2 weeks, election night or election month, as Dan McLaughlin said, be sure to find him at National Review. So to you, Dan, to Josh, to Chuck, thank you all so much for an excellent conversation. I think maybe at some point after the election, when we know the outcome, we can maybe deal with the aftermath and pick up with where we left off, and that's the future of the conservative movement, something about which we care deeply here at the Foundation. Also, for those of you who are interested in the Foundation's take as the election night and election month are unfolding, you can tune in on election night. For the first time in our history, we're going to be analyzing the results as they come in, not for the purpose of calling the election. We'll leave that to some other people and to the partisans, but for the purpose of making sense of what the next steps are for those of us who are interested in right-minded conservative policy at the local, state, and federal level. In the meantime, thanks again to our guests. Thank you for tuning in. May God bless you in the meantime, and of course, may He always continue to bless this great country.